Hi, anybody who is here. I am going to get started in just a couple minutes. I'm going to give people a few minutes just to make it on. I know there are a lot of moms that are planning on watching, so they're probably getting kids down and all that jazz. So I'm going to give people just a few more minutes. I should probably have some like music going on or something, like elevator music or maybe something upbeat. I'm not that prepared, so we just have the clicking of my computer and my Facebook notifications going on. So there is if you're watching on YouTube, I don't know if you can see it on mobile, but there is like a chat and stuff. I guess it'll depend on how many people are on the call. Right now, we just have one person, so I think it's Lindsay. So, hi, Lindsay. Um, but I will take questions afterwards, but you can also post them in the event. All right, it's like 9:01, so I'll still give people a couple minutes. Looks like we have a couple people on. Um, I know it's going to be a smaller group than the last time I did this, since the Memory52 project group is kind of small. So I'll just give people just a couple more minutes. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and start. I'll get the boring stuff out of the way, like who I am and why the heck am I talking to you about the exposure triangle. I'm Paige, and I am a child portrait photographer, among other things, but this is my daughter, Millie, and I have a group called the Memory52 Project, which is a really small group, and I feel bad because it's somewhat neglected because I've just been so crazy busy with my graphic design business this year. But I love taking pictures of children. It is just very near and dear to my heart, and so that's why I started the Memory52 project, because I wanted to help other parents take better pictures of their children, because, you know, as a mother myself, I know that children are constantly changing and they're growing so quickly, and we want to capture every moment, but I also want to help people take really nice pictures that aren't just snapshots. So in my opinion, the the best thing that you can do to learn how to take something from just a standard snapshot to a compelling picture is really understanding the exposure triangle, because this is where a lot of the artistic stuff comes in. So, I mean, and a lot of it is composition and other things too, but this is how these are the settings that you need to know in order to make your camera do the things that you want it to do. So this is the exposure triangle, and the exposure triangle it refers to the three elements or camera settings that relate to light and how that light enters your camera. So these three elements are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO or ISO. So even if you're shooting with a phone camera or a point and shoot camera that doesn't have manual settings where you get to pick these things, your camera is still using aperture, shutter speed, and ISO because that is how it creates the exposure for your image. So if you are shooting with a point and shoot or you're shooting with, like an iPhone or something, you're not going to have as great of control over these settings as you would if you were using a camera that had manual settings, but that doesn't mean that not knowing these, that not knowing these things is okay. There are apps on for, the iPhone or even on Android that will let you control some of the settings. So knowing these things are important because you can kind of manipulate your camera a little bit. And I know a lot of point and shoot cameras, even though you may not be able to shoot in full manual, there are different settings that you can change that will kind of manipulate these three things a little bit. So the most important thing, in this presentation, I'm gonna go through each of these three elements and how they work individually. But then at the end, I'm going to talk about how they all work together, because the most important thing that I want you to get from this presentation is that all of these elements impact the others. So you can never just, change the aperture without also thinking about how it's going to affect your shutter and your ISO. So I'm going to go ahead and dig in, and then at the end, if anybody's still around, I will answer questions, or you can ask questions in the event on Facebook. So the first thing I'm going to start with is your ISO or your ISO. I always say ISO, and some people say ISO. I guess it doesn't really matter. So if you remember having a film camera and buying actual film for your camera, a lot of there were different speeds that you could buy for your camera. So there was 400, 200, and the number on the film referred to how sensitive the film was to light. So if you wanted to, change your ISO in a film camera, you had to change the entire roll of film. So in digital cameras, the ISO refers to the digital camera's sensor sensitivity to light. So it's kind of nice because you don't have to change everything, you just change a setting on your camera. So with the ISO, the lower the number, the more light you're going to need to achieve a good exposure. For example, an ISO around 100 is going to be best suited outside in bright sunlight, or if you're, or if you have like studio lights or something like that. Also, the lower the ISO, the less grain or noise you're going to have in your image. You should be able, most cameras, if they're a newer digital camera that you've gotten in the past couple of years and you're using a digital SLR or like a nicer point and shoot camera, and really even the iPhone, I've gone I think up to like an ISO of 800 on the iPhone without having like so much grain that I wouldn't use it. You're gonna be able to stick your ISO around probably the 800 or lower range. You want to always have your ISO be as low as it can go, because the trade-off for going to a higher ISO is that you have a lot of noise in your image. And noise is, when you look at, if you think of like old film images where the pictures look grainy, that is noise. So the great thing about portrait photography, though, is sometimes you can just embrace that noise, and that noise will add so much texture and dimension to an image and really kind of give it this almost like, old time feel to it, and can really make it have this classic look. So, in some ways, if you're shooting in low light, a little bit of grain is going to be okay. So I have two images here, and as you can see, they have a similar exposure, but in the first image, the ISO was 320. So we don't have any noise in this image. In the second image, this ISO is 25,600. And I know it's kind of hard to see on your screen, but there's a lot of noise in this image. There's color noise. It's really grainy. If I were to zoom in on this egg here, the edges aren't very sharp and crisp. So, you know, and this is more of like a product photography type shot. So, you know, I probably would have to throw this image away, where this one would be usable. So that's ISO. The next thing we're going to talk about is the aperture. And I think that for portrait photography, aperture is the most important aspect that you're going to set on your camera. It gives you a lot of artistic control. Aperture refers to the measure of how open or closed the iris of your lens is. It's reported in numbers that are referred to as f-stops. So if you hear somebody, you know, say, you know, raise or lower your f-stop, they're referring to the aperture. The lower your f-stop, the wider the lens iris is. So it's letting in more light. And then as you go down in your as you go up in your aperture, the opening of the iris starts to close, so it's letting in less light. And aperture is probably the most confusing because the lower number means a bigger opening and the bigger number means a smaller opening. And, you know, so I just like to think, you know, that the low, so I just kind of think of it in regards to the lower the number, the shallower the depth of field, and then the bigger the number, the deeper the depth of field. And depth of field is how much of the focal plane is going to show in focus. So referring to that, aperture, one of the most important things that aperture does is it controls your depth of field of the image, and this is where a lot of the artistic stuff for photography comes in. Knowing how to control your depth of field is one of the most important elements in taking an image from looking like just a snapshot to something that looks like a professional image. Narrow apertures or the higher f-stop give a greater depth of field, and they allow more of the scene to be in focus. So if you're taking a picture of a landscape, then you're going to want to have a higher f-stop. Where wider apertures, the lower f-stop numbers, they create a shallow depth of field. And this is most often used in portrait photography. So in this image here of my daughter, I was shot at an f-stop of 4.5. And as you can see, she's in nice focus here, but the background is completely blurred out. And so this can be a really great compositional tool because this was just taken in our front yard, and behind my daughter is actually a road, and it's not really something great to look at. So by utilizing my aperture to create that shallow depth of field, I created a really interesting portrait of my daughter versus just a snapshot of her in our front yard. And here in the two examples I have, you can see the first one of the eggs, you have the 3 eggs, but only the blue egg is in focus. This was shot at an f-stop of 2. So this has a very shallow depth of field. Over here, all 3 of the eggs are more in focus, and so this was shot at an f-stop of f11. All right, and so the last element we have is the shutter speed. And the shutter speed is the measure of how long the shutter remains open and how long the sensor is exposed to light. So it's measured in fractions of a second. So this picture here was taken at 1/250th of a second. This was taken at a 1/2 a second. A faster shutter speed gives the sensor less time to collect light, and so it's going to result in a lower exposure. Slower shutter speeds allow more time for the sensor to collect light, and they result in a higher exposure. In portrait photography, when you are working with subjects, especially children that move around a lot, you want to be able to keep your shutter speed up above 1/60th of a second or higher, because you don't want motion blur. And I'm sure we've all taken pictures of our children, on a swing or something, where you take the picture and then you have, kind of the trailing ghost effect of your child. And that all has to do with the shutter speed. So when you're taking pictures of movement, or you're just outside taking pictures of your kids, I like to keep my shutter speed above 1/250th of a second, because my kids move really fast and I don't want to get motion blur. So, so that's something to take into effect too. So if your child's just sitting there, you can probably have your shutter speed a little bit lower because they're sitting still. But if your children are anything like mine, my children never sit still. So my rule of thumb for my kids, because I have two really active toddlers, is I usually keep my shutter speed above 1/250th of a second. And then again, back to these two images. So in this one, this was stationary, but I was handheld, so it wasn't on a tripod or anything. I shot it at 1/250th of a second. There's no motion blur. On this one, it was at 1/2 of a second, and I, moved my hand slightly, and you have the little ghost egg. So, so that is shutter speed. So now let's bring it all together. So these three elements combined create the exposure for your image. So if you have a camera that you can put on manual, you are going to be, you're going to be making a decision on each of these three elements. So you're going to tell your camera what to do. If you have a camera that doesn't shoot in manual, you may only be able to control one or two of these elements. So you're going to have to decide what to do based on the elements that you can control. The reason that we call this the exposure triangle is because none of the elements can be changed in isolation. So if you change one of the elements, it'll affect the other two elements in a constant triangle. And so I think the hardest thing for somebody who's maybe never shot in manual, or they don't really know what they're doing when they're shooting in manual, is they don't know where to start. And much of where you start depends on the available light you have. I mean, if you're shooting outside, you have a lot more available light than if you're shooting inside on a gloomy day. So that will come into some of it, but where I like to start is with my aperture, because I like to control the depth of field first. So if I'm going to be taking a picture of my daughter, going back to this picture of Millie, this picture was taken, the sun was starting to go down, and so, so the first thing that I did was I set my depth of field. So I set my aperture at 4.5 because I knew I wanted her face in good focus. A big thing to remember with the aperture, especially in portrait photography, people always want to go if you have a camera that can shoot at, an f-stop of 1.8, people always want to go down to 1.8. And you don't need to do that, because if I would have been shooting at 1.8 with this picture, her eyes aren't exactly on the same plane, and so one eye would have been a little bit more in focus than the other eye. So because I wanted both of her eyes to be in good focus, and I wanted to see her hair and have all of that framing, I started with an f-stop of 4.5. Then the next thing I went with was my shutter speed, because when we were taking these images, she was outside and she was playing on our front steps. So she was moving around a lot. So I set my shutter speed at 1/250th of a second because, like I said, I kind of stick around there for when I'm shooting pictures of my kids and they're moving around. And then so the last thing I set was my ISO, which I set at 800. So that's where I needed it to be to get enough available light. So that's kind of how I go through the process of choosing what settings I'm going to use when I'm taking pictures. And to give you another example, in these two images, so in this first, as you can see, these pictures are similarly exposed. I mean, um, this one's a little bit under, but I mean, they're very similarly exposed. But but I wanted to achieve two different things with these pictures. So with this picture, I just wanted the blue egg to be in focus. So I set my f-stop to 2.0, and then I was handheld and my hands can get kind of shaky, so I set my shutter speed at 1/250th of a second. And then to get enough available light, I had to move my ISO to 320. And that allowed me to get the picture that I was looking for. On the flip side, on this picture, I wanted all three of the eggs to be more in focus. So I started with an f-stop of 11, and then I put my shutter speed down to 1/60th of a second because this wasn't anything that was going to move on me. It was just, just stationary eggs. So I set my shutter speed at 1/60th of a second and my ISO at 2500. Now with my camera, I can go pretty high with my ISO without getting a lot of noise and grain because I have a pro camera. If you have like a Canon Rebel or like a Nikon D3200, you're probably going to want to stay around 800. So probably, in this image, what I would have had to do is put my camera on a tripod and then brought my shutter speed down lower if I needed to get my ISO lower. But this is product photography, not portrait photography, which is a little different. So, but I just wanted to show you these examples to show you how you can get how these two pictures are similarly exposed, but because in this picture I only wanted the middle egg in focus, in this picture I wanted all three in focus, how I had to change my settings in order to achieve that. So that's all I have for you. So that's the exposure triangle. I hope it wasn't too confusing. I hope maybe you learned a couple things. If you have questions, I think there's only like 2 of you on here. So if you have questions, you can go ahead and ask them over in the event, and I'll just move over there and I will just respond back to you. So that is all. I hope you have a wonderful evening. And if you do have an iPhone, there's an app called Camera Plus. It will allow you to set your ISO and your shutter speed. And if you have an Android camera, an Android phone, I believe it's still called Camera Plus. I believe it's like the same thing. So I would check that out. I think it's like $199 or $299 or something like that. But you can check out those apps, and that'll allow you to change some of the settings on your camera so you can kind of play around with these things. And I'm working on a live video of me doing, using Camera Plus on my iPhone to kind of show you how you can change some of the settings on your iPhone. So I'm working on that. It won't be a live thing, but it'll be like a pre-recorded thing, and I'll post that in the Memory52 group. So, all right, so that's all. Have a wonderful evening. Thanks, everyone. Bye.